I wasn't able to pay the rent last week, and I won't be able to pay in May. Here's what I know. That's not my fault, and I shouldn't have to. It's amazing to be on the phone with so many of you tonight to talk about our campaign for a homes guarantee and what we can do together to win what we all deserve. Many of you joined us last week, and we're so glad to have you back. And some of you are joining us for the first time tonight. Welcome. If you're on your computer, please put your name and city in the chat box so that we can say hi. Even when so much is unsteady and uncertain and unstable right now, it's critical that we commit ourselves to bold ideals, radical actions, and that we identify new ways to organize and win together. We're not just here for immediate relief. We're here for a homes guarantee. In the richest country in the history of the world, we can and we must ensure that everyone has a safe, accessible, sustainable, truly and permanently affordable home. Last week, we did a training on Tenant Organizing 101. We had such an incredible engagement that the panelists stayed on the line for 30 minutes after the call ended. That gave us the idea for tonight. Tonight, we'll dig in even deeper. We'll also do less talking, and you all get a chance to ask more questions. We have a panel of experienced grassroots leaders and tenant organizers ready to workshop your challenges and push you to dream big and build more power. Before we get going, I want to tell you a little bit about the logistics of this call. Because of how many people are on the phone, all your lines are muted. If you're joining us on video, you'll be able to see the faces of the speakers. If you have a question and you're joining us through the Zoom app, you can type it into the question and answer box. You should be able to see that at the bottom of your screen. And we'll respond to as many as we can later in the program. Feel free to use the chat box to communicate with other participants. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can email us at homes@peoplesaction.org. I believe that they're going to drop that in the chat as well. If you're not on Zoom and just dialed in through the phone, that's more than okay too. We're glad you're all here and excited to talk together. Just so you know, we're recording this call to share with people who are not able to join us tonight, and we do not intend for this to be a media call, but speakers should assume that they are in public and on record. Now, before we dig in, we need to reground ourselves. Why are we here? Who are we fighting with and for? Why does it matter so much that we build tenant power? It's my pleasure to introduce Emma Rehac, a grassroots leader with Community Voices Heard. I hope I did not butcher your name. Thank you, Emma. You're up next.
Thank you. You pronounced it correctly, like the only person who does that. So yeah, I'm Emma Rehac. I'm a senior in high school in New York City and a member leader of Community Voices Heard. CVH is a member-led grassroots organization. We're part of the Homes Guarantee campaign and an affiliate with People's Action. So I kind of want to talk about what young people are facing in this moment. I think the voices of young people are so largely neglected in so many conversations that surround public policy, but especially in conversations surrounding housing. Many young folks are underage, and we typically aren't the ones paying the bills or, serving as a head of households, but America's response to COVID-19 is going to have an enormous influence on our well-being, our health, our future. And housing justice is something that really closely intersects with so many other issues, especially things like education or transportation equity, all of which are things that really inform a child's upbringing. And right now in this moment, students are struggling to adapt to remote learning. A lot of students have no schooling at all anymore. And, many of us don't have a safe or stable home in which we can learn. We're struggling to care for our siblings, care for our neighbors. We are here as we watch our parents lose their jobs, lose their income, or we watch our parents continue to go to work, afraid that they're also going to lose their health. And so far, our government's response to this crisis is going to leave us 3 steps behind where we were when this crisis started. We need to be responding to COVID-19 with sustainable solutions. If we had ambitious long-term solutions like a homes guarantee in place already, we'd be in so much better shape and be much better protected during this crisis now. And especially from a New Yorker's perspective, looking at our new state budget, I think is so clear that we have no room for austerity. We need deep investment now. We need policies that are made with the mindset of prevention rather than response. And in response to coronavirus, New York State has committed to no longer shutting people's water or electricity off. But, things like water, electricity should never been getting shut off in the first place. In so many public schools, including mine, it took a pandemic for us to have soap in the bathrooms. And so this is a moment that's really elevating so many of the issues we've been organizing around already for decades. And I really hope we can utilize this moment to continue to highlight the issues we've already been organizing around. I hope we can continue to develop deeper and more extended empathy for each other across the country and realize that we all have very deeply personal stake in what is happening right now.
Emma, thank you so much for your leadership and your work. Your story is so important. And frankly, if every senior in high school is as brilliant as you are, then the future is bright and a lot of tenant power is out there for the building. Before we know exactly where we're going, we need to know where we are. My name is Raghuveer, and I want to talk a little bit about what's happening right now in this moment. First, just today, we learned that over 16 million people have filed for unemployment in the last several weeks. That's 16 million whose incomes have been zeroed out by no fault of their own, but as a result of this pandemic. We have to consider something. Nearly 12 million people were paying over 50% of their income to rent even before the pandemic hit. And now you add in mass job loss, and we've got a crisis of epic proportions. So epic, in fact, that we don't even know yet how many people were unable to pay their rent on April 1st, or how many may face difficulties come May 1st. The second thing is that Congress is coming back soon to negotiate the next relief package in the next couple of weeks. But what we know is that they're not talking that much about housing. The organizations involved in this campaign, like Community Voices Heard, for example, have been talking to House and Senate leadership for the last few weeks, and it's actually becoming clear that housing's not really on the agenda. But we're organizers, so we're gonna change that. We, the people, must make sure that they hear our outcry about our rents and the stability of our homes. And we must ensure that Congress passes the next package to include a national rent and mortgage suspension and much more. More on that later. Third, the pandemic is hitting Black and Brown communities the hardest. I know many of you probably saw the same maps that I did this week that show that all of the communities that have already been in crisis because of centuries of racial capitalism in America are the ones that are facing the most COVID cases and the most COVID deaths. We have to consider the disproportionate impact that our communities of color and our poor and working class communities are facing during this crisis. And then we have to use that grounding to shape all of our solutions. Finally, tenants are organizing. Across the country, we're hearing from more and more tenants, more and more stories of tenants knocking on their neighbors' doors, leaving a flyer, forming tenant unions, and scheming about escalation tactics to win their demands. Tenants in Los Angeles have been circling city council members' homes, honking in their cars for rent suspension. Tenants in Minneapolis rode their bikes and took their cars out to a bank yesterday, demanding the same thing. Tenants in buildings across America are drafting letters to their landlords, and we are on the precipice of a mass uprising. And tonight's call is a step towards that. So now I'm going to pass it to my comrade, John Washington, to set us up for the call.
Great. Thanks, Tara. So we need a homes guarantee that puts people before profits, that ensures that everyone has a safe, accessible, sustainable, and permanently affordable home. If we had a homes guarantee right now, and if housing was a public good instead of a commodity, dealing with this crisis would be totally different. When we think about organizing tenants today, it's not just for immediate relief, it's for long-term systems change. And we've seen tenants across the country who have actually been able to take control of their buildings. And I can only imagine what it would be like if we had more social housing at this moment. So last week, we went over the basics of tenant organizing. First, starting with relationship mapping. Who do you know? Who do you see a lot? Who do people in the building go to for help and support? Who are the people with the crazy nicknames? Every building has somebody who everybody knows. Buildings and neighborhoods already have leaders. Think about where to start and who can help you build for the long run. Flyer and canvas. Flyer the building, put out messaging on social media, proposing a virtual tenant meeting. List building. Make a list of the numbers that you have. Write a script. What are you inviting to people to do? What are you inviting them to join? What time of day should you call? And what happens if people don't respond? One-on-ones. The most important thing to building trust is deepening relationship with folks, identifying their self-interest, hopes, dreams, fears, barriers to organizing. But it's really important, beyond just tenant organizing, for us in this moment as people who are living through this crisis, that we actually do build close relationships because we're going to need each other. Thinking about having a tenant meeting. What are the demands? Who is the target? What is the commitment that the tenants have to one another, and what are the tactics that they're going to use? Demands. Obviously, rent is a huge concern, but there are other demands too. Most folks have been struggling with issues with their landlords for a long time, and it's important to embed those in any conversation that you're having about rent suspension, and have this not just be about this moment, but about how people are living on a daily basis. And the last one is tactics. So anytime you're using a tactic, it's important that it's done collectively. So if there's a letter to the landlord, it needs to be everybody on that. Social media, signs, local press, whatever you're working on, making sure that you're clear on those tactics and unified in them, which is really rooted in the trust building. So some of the basics that we talked about last week, and a key theme that came up and we'll discuss more tonight, is trust. What we said last week was start small and build at the speed of trust. We sent you home with a few assignments last week. Namely, we asked you to start organizing if you had not done so yet, and to make a list of everyone you know in your building, to do some sharp relationship mapping, to make a flyer around the virtual tenant meeting that you may be having, and to start building deeper relationships with your neighbors, and create a set of demands that your building wants to win in the immediate and the short term. Today, we want to know how that's going. We want to workshop any issues that may be coming up. So start putting your questions in the chat now, and we'll start by digging into some questions that you sent over to us by email. But first, let me allow our esteemed panel to introduce themselves. So my name is John Washington. I'm now with People's Action, but I did 7 years of organizing in Buffalo with Push Buffalo. We were able to build a community land trust, build over 100 units of affordable housing, and last year we were part of a movement that changed how housing works in New York State forever. And now I want to pass it on to Linda. Linda, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you, John. My name is Linda Armitage. I am a leader and organizer with Jane Addams Senior Caucus in Chicago, and also a member of the Homes Guarantee team with People's Action. I have been organizing seniors in public housing for about 6 years now. And it's a big challenge, but it's also amazingly wonderful. And I think Tabatha is next.
Yes. Hi, my name is Tabatha. I'm a leader with People Organized for Westside Renewal in Los Angeles. Currently, I've been organizing a few buildings in Los Angeles around COVID, and I'm also working on a mutual aid network. I'll pass it on to Divya.
Hey everybody, my name is Divya Sundaram. I'm an organizer with Community Voices Heard, a Black and Brown-led organization based in New York State, organizing with both public housing residents and private tenants. And I'll pass it to Emma.
I'm Emma Rehac. I'm a member leader with Community Voices Heard and a high school student in New York City. And now I'm going to pass it to Juan.
Hi everybody, my name is Juan Nunez, or Juan Esteban. I'm a leader at the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition. I've been organizing my building now for over 10 years, and I've also organized at least 10 buildings that are under my landlord's portfolio as well. So I want to give it up now to Tiana.
Hi, my name is Tiana Caldwell. I am a leader with Tenant in Kansas City, Missouri. I have been doing this a little over a year. We started back in February of last year, but what a difference a year makes. We fought and won a tenants' bill of rights here in our city. We are still fighting, right? You've got to keep fighting to make sure that you get to keep what you win and also that it's enforced. And so we're still fighting. We have started a state coalition here in Missouri with other organizers and organizing institutions or organizations around the state. So I'm just trying to do our part. You know, it's about the people. I mean, this is a crisis right now, but this has been going on forever, right? I'll pass it back to John.
Great. So now, were there any questions that came up in the chat?
Well, John, I actually think we're going to start with the panel. So I'll actually take it back over. Again, my name is Tara, and I'm with the Homes Guarantee Campaign based at People's Action, but also thrilled to be able to organize with Tiana at KC Tenants in Kansas City, Missouri. I've been organizing tenants for 4 or 5 years now, but on the ground in a grassroots fashion for about a year. So these are clearly some experts on tenant organizing of a large breadth of experience, right? Like some of these folks on the panel organize in public housing. Some of them have organized tenants in private housing. Some of them have organized and won community land trusts and tenant takeovers of buildings. Some are just beginning, and some have been doing this for over a decade. So I want everyone who's attending tonight to feel like there are people on this panel who can speak to you no matter what your experience with tenant organizing is, or even if you've done no tenant organizing before this moment. These are really the experts, not because they've read a book, but because they've actually gotten out there and tried talking with their neighbors and building power in the streets. So first, we're going to start by taking questions that folks sent in by email in the last week. And as we said, this call is going to be a little different from the last 2 calls. We're going to do a lot more workshopping and just digging into questions that people ask rather than just talking at you. So with that being said, if you have questions that you didn't email in, you should either put them in the chat box or better yet, in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure that we get to those next. There will also be an opportunity for you to ask questions directly by unmuting yourself in the next section. But first, a couple of the questions that we got via email in the last week. There were a number of questions from folks around the country who expressed some trepidation because they were organizing in scattered site properties. So they were like, listen, I don't live in a building. I can't go around my building and flyer everyone. How do I organize people across these scattered properties that one landlord owns? There were other folks who asked a similar question that was about rural organizing. So I don't live in a city. I don't live close to people who I can organize with. How do I still organize those folks? So first, I want to turn it over to Tabatha, who's been organizing in a couple buildings in Los Angeles.
Thanks. Yeah, so as far as organizing in several buildings, my recommendation is to find leaders in each building. So as John was mentioning earlier, most buildings have someone who like everyone knows, who throws parties, who people go to as a point of reference, you know, that everyone has a nickname for. People already have established relationships in their buildings. So you want to identify who that person is in a building where you don't live, that you might have trouble getting into, or you might, you know, something might go wrong if they find out you're in there. So find someone who lives in there who you can build a relationship with, and just focus on building a relationship with them, focus on helping them build relationships with their tenants, and use that relationship building to organize without you necessarily having to be there every day. That's what's been working for us out here in LA.
Awesome. Thanks, Tabatha. And then John, I know you've done a lot of scattered site organizing, and then also through your work with the statewide coalition in New York, you might have some thoughts on rural organizing and the challenges, but also the opportunity there.
Yeah, so I'll say like in areas where there are scattered sites, especially Buffalo doesn't have a lot of big buildings, You can do a little bit of research on the property owner or the LLC. I always say follow the money. So your property owner might have one name, but where do you send the check and who do you write the check to is usually who to find. And then you can look for, if there's an address where you're sending your payments, look for companies under those other addresses, Google the address to see who else is there, and you can definitely identify your targets. I think now is a really difficult time for scattered site organizing, but I think you can still make that flyer, put it in people's mailboxes or put in people's doorways to try to develop that contact. And if you're close with folks in the neighborhood, you can just kind of, hey, you know, who's staying there, who's been in, you know, and so that's, again, why it's important to have relationships, because they can usually help you build into and tap into the existing relationships that are around. And definitely feel free to reach out to me if you want any help with like logistics of researching who your landlord is and how to find the other buildings they own.
And I would just add, in Kansas City, there's a ton of single family rental property. So it's actually, you know, a handful of apartment buildings, a lot of like sixplexes, but then a lot of single family buildings. And so definitely want to validate and lift back up what John was saying about doing research on your landlord, because there are ways that you can find out what other properties they own and then go flyer those people to try to form a scattered site tenant union. There's also ways that we can do this online. And this is a really good time actually for online organizing, because there's not a lot of door-to-door organizing we can do anyway. So one way that we've found that folks are connecting in Kansas City is through like Facebook pages, right? We've got like tenant Facebook pages and landlords on blast Facebook pages, and folks are posting about their landlords there. So that's a really good initial way to connect with folks across buildings who you might not run into in the hallway or you might never have known before. So hopefully that's helpful. Another question that people were sending us a bunch in the last week is that when they tried reaching out to their neighbors, they were having a lot of trouble getting people respond. So we had folks say, you know, I sent out a letter, I flyered my whole building, but no one responded. No one texted me back. Or, you know, someone said, I wrote a letter calling for a rent strike in the building, but no one got back to me. We had a meeting and then nothing happened. No one responded and followed up after we met for the first time. So I want to toss it to a couple folks with a ton of experience here. We'll start with Juan, who organizes again in the Northwest Bronx.
Yeah, so what I would advise you is when you send out the letter, let's not go directly into a rent strike. I would recommend doing like a wellness check with your neighbors, just to kind of see how they're doing mentally, health-wise, if they need access to food, you know, and then you can come around into discussing potential rent strike. But first you got to like open them up, because a lot of people don't like talking about, you know, their hardships. They don't want to admit that they're not going to be able to pay the rent the next month. So I would advise to do a wellness check first, just to see how they're doing, because a lot of people are just really feel very vulnerable right now, and they kind of just want somebody to talk to. So you have to sort of be like a therapist at first, get them to really open up to you, and then you can ease into the rent strike. And as far as letters, I would advise a flyer. Like for example, in my building, my landlord decided a couple days ago to post a letter, sort of advising people reminding people that rent is due. So I just wrote something on that flyer there. I left like a number and an email saying, hey, contact me if you have issues with rent. And then on Monday, I'm going to post another flyer next to that flyer, letting them know about any resources that we have, not just like regarding rent, but also regarding meals. And as far as a meeting, when you have a meeting in your building, don't feel bad if nothing happens. It already happened. The meeting happened. That's number one, right? So you got to do sort of like a next steps in your meeting and follow up with people that showed up. I hope that when you do have meetings in your building, that you have a signing sheet and you write down people's phone numbers, and then you just follow up. And then maybe you can schedule monthly meetings. But just know that a meeting means that something did happen, right? And that's where you start. Once you have a meeting, that's already a success story. So just follow up with people, get their numbers, and then figure out the next steps collectively.
Juan, that's awesome. I want to ask you just one quick follow-up question, because I know you organize with folks who speak English and folks who speak Spanish. What are your tips for folks who are organizing in buildings where English may not be the dominant language for everyone?
Well, honestly, if you're in a building that only Spanish speakers. I mean, thankfully, I'm able to speak the language, so it helps me. But let's say if you're part of a religious institution that perhaps a lot of the Spanish speakers attend, like for example, my mother's church is predominantly Spanish speakers, but there's also like English speaking people that go to the church, reaching out to the church, to the priest to sort of reach out to the tenants. But also if you have a language barrier, just try to find a tenant in the building that's multilingual that can help you, right? And then try to reach out to that tenant first, because you're gonna need somebody to connect you to everybody else if you don't speak the language. So look for the tenant that does speak the predominant language in the building, and then have them join you, like as far as like the leaders in the building, because if you don't have that connection, it's gonna be really hard to get people to join you.
I just wanted to make a quick point on that. If you're also dealing with folks who speak other languages, like in Buffalo, there's like 41 languages spoken in our neighborhood. There are always people who are translators and buffers, and often young people do that work for parents and elders. So if you can get a little bit of a communication, you can at least say, hey, who do you talk to when you need someone to help you deal with a system or communicate with the legal system? Who does that? And usually folks can at least understand that and then get you to that person.
Thanks so much, Juan and John. So Linda, just to tee the question back up for you, what do you do when you're having trouble getting people to respond or engage? I know you have tons of stories of this from your experience organizing your building.
Yes, thank you, Tara. Number one hit on the idea of trust, building up trust over time, and it does take time, and we need patience. And also trusting ourselves as organizers to hear other people's stories. Now, sometimes, of course, we always say it's in your self-interest to do this. Well, sometimes self-interest is overrun by various things. Juan and John both have said, you know, people don't want to admit to being afraid or whatever, or don't want to say I need help. Speaking of my generation and in my experience, seniors now come from a generation where they just don't want to organize. They were not brought up to organize or to be organized as people and stand up for what they want. And this is really probably my biggest challenge. And I experienced this when I first started, when our building was sold to the Public Housing Authority in Chicago. We had to fight back against the seller and also CHA at the time. And hey, Linda, what are we going to do? Well, you know, I never thought of myself as a leader, and a lot of older people do not think, and even some young people probably don't think of themselves as leaders either. And you just, as an organizer, I think you have to respect that and build up their self-confidence. And it takes, someone said it's like a therapist. It's true. It's true. You have to listen and hope you make the right responses. I saw a question here from someone who asked, I think her name was Wendy. She said something about what happens when you talk to people till you're blue in the face. I have done that, but you know, at some point you have to let it go. And if they don't want to participate, they don't. And they may come back later. That has happened to me. But yeah, you know, you can only expend so much of your own energy on it. So it's basically trust and respect for the people you're talking with.
John, I wanted to turn to you because there was an interesting question in the chat from someone who asked, trust makes sense. It was Michelle who asked, trust does make sense, but do we have time? And I want to toss that to you because I feel like you've been really good at regrounding me in urgency, but also what's really important.
So one, there's a reality that I think this is going to last a lot longer than we think it does right now. I appreciate their messaging of like flattening the curve, but the reality is the curve is actually rising. So even if it flattens, it doesn't mean that there isn't an increase in cases. And so I feel like we're going to be in this for a while. And I think that this is all stuff that we needed to be doing before COVID in general, and to change landlord and tenant relationships. And so I think that there is always time for trust, because if you do not do things out of trust, you will have to redo them over and over and over again. So I will take 3 people that I trust over 300 people that I've never met. And in a lot of our campaign work, there's been so many times when people are like, oh, you just need to get more people. And a group of 15 to 20 leaders were able to do something that organizations and other folks that had hundreds of people that were showing up, but didn't know what they were doing and didn't trust each other could do. So for me, I have definitely moved too fast and without trust, and then got grounded and reminded a year, 2 years later, by having to redo all of my work because there wasn't trust. And in the moment of our greatest power, which was the moment of our greatest tension, everything that we created fell apart because of that lack of trust. So I think that time is a real linear, like white supremacist concept. And we really need to think about the fact that how fast does time move when you have 5 people instead of 1, right? So trust is the most important thing because it's what allows you to grow and hold consistency. And if you do things without trust, you might do one thing faster, but the whole arc that you see is going to move so much slower.
Tabatha, I think, wanted to jump in on this one.
I just wanted to add to something Linda said, where like sometimes you talk to people and you just have to let them go. Absolutely. I would just say like stay open as a resource for those people, because like she mentioned, they might come back. Like a lot of people don't see the urgency right now. Like a lot of people maybe had money to pay rent in April, but like come the last week of April, they might realize, oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to make it in May. And if you were just like, all right, no worries, like just let me know if you need anything, like, you know, I'm always here as a resource, or like if you ever need something, reach out. Like they'll come back in May and be like, oh my God, you were right, I don't have money this month, like what am I gonna do? So always just lead with love and be there for each other, even if like they're not ready to join the fight yet.
That's powerful. Wow, so many golden nuggets in the last 2 minutes of this. Time is a white supremacist concept. Great, great. Okay, so one just practical note I want to make is that Juan brought up something really important that is worth digging into. If you're having a meeting and people aren't responding to you after the meeting, let's be honest, you probably didn't have a great meeting. And we've all been to bad meetings. So it's actually really important to be thoughtful about what your first tenant meeting feels like, what it looks like, what the vibe is. Obviously, it's all a little different and challenging now because we're doing this all virtually, but there's still ways to create a really rich meeting where we feel connected to one another. So what I always practice is like, before I schedule any meeting, I need to be really clear on what the purpose of that meeting is and what my desired outcomes are, so that I can communicate that to other people and they can make a decision about whether or not they actually want to join that meeting. And then there's key elements to a really effective meeting in my mind. You got to start with checking in with people and like building real relationships. So ask people a question that's not related to the purpose of the meeting, that just helps you get to know them. And then like create an agenda that is actually outcome based. Don't create an agenda that's simply stuff that you could have covered via email, or else people's eyes will start glazing over and they'll start dreaming about their beer that's waiting for them in the other room, right? And then finally, I think every good meeting needs to end with an evaluation. We say this at KC Tenants all the time. Everything worth doing is worth evaluating. And if you evaluate your meeting, you'll hear from folks whether or not they actually liked it. And that'll be a good indicator of whether they're going to come back the next time or whether they're going to engage in your organizing anymore. Okay, so the next question that we have here before we'll open it up to some of the ones that have come in so far, a lot of people are asking us about intimidation or fear that they're hearing from their neighbors. So some folks are saying, my neighbors won't even come to the meeting because they're scared of the landlord. or my building is fearful of the landlord and therefore won't even entertain the idea of a tactic like a rent strike. I think all of us on this call can speak to this one in one degree or another. And a lot of it is about trust, which we already talked about. But I want to open it up and just see if there's anyone here who wants to speak specifically to what you would do if you were organizing right now and someone came to you in the building and said, I'm fearful of intimidation or retaliation. What would you do? Juan, do you want to go first?
Well, one thing that I did in my building was that one of the first few meetings we had it in my apartment, so people could feel safe inside and don't think that the super's going to hear them or that it's going to come out of or the landlord is going to find out. And also encourage people to know their rights, that you are entitled to hold meetings in your building, in your lobby. But if they do feel like intimidated, just one, have a one-on-one with that person, right? Build them up. And two, if you feel that that's kind of like everybody in the building is feeling that intimidation, then if you're comfortable enough, have it in your apartment, closed doors, and then that could lead to a bigger lobby building. But that's a good way to get people to feel safe if you do it inside.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say I think that fear is often an absence of trust. So I think there's no way to like immediately just, that person's fears are going to be eliminated, but it's more like, can you have a meeting where people start to understand each other better, understand each other's situations, and understand that people can have each other's backs. And I think storytelling is so important to that, especially if you live in an apartment where there's different levels of privilege or class, to say, like, if the person who can pay rent knew that the landlord was intimidating a single mother who couldn't pay rent, like, would they make a move in solidarity? So I think that when it comes to the courage and the strength is like, there are consequences, there are risks. We're always going to have to take risks. But we also know that it's a risk not to act. So I think that all of those things get, you can't fight fire with fire, you have to fight it with water. And that water is doing the relationship building that will then allow you to actually make a real ask of someone instead of like, hey, just join my rent strike. It's, no, I really need you to support me and lock arms with me and be with me in this struggle because of a connection that was built previously. So I think that intimidation, like, we've all been intimidated by things, and then think about who in your life you're going to call on if you're intimidated. What are the type of things that they're going to tell you, and how can you grow into being that person for someone else and for the group of tenants you're trying to work with?
Okay, now we're going to take a couple questions from the chat. A while back, Elizabeth asked the question, how do you organize with social distancing? I want to open that up, and I think maybe Tabatha, you could start.
Yeah, so it's a little tougher, I think, because the overall arc moves a little slower. But what I've been doing is just like holding Zoom meetings and seeing who will come to the meeting. And I think, because you can't just like sit in one's apartment and have a one-on-one. So it's just a lot of like constantly checking in with people. Are you okay? Like, is there anything you need? And building out things like group chats. And just kind of like, you're taking a little bit smaller steps because it's a lot harder to have one-on-ones. But if you can get to a point where you have everyone's phone number and are able to have phone conversations with them, I would say that's your strongest tool right now.
Yeah, if I could also add kind of what everyone has been talking about with trust and empathy as well, is that, in organizing, you're supposed to be using your experience first, and every individual person is an expert in their own experiences. And I think that then develops a lot more confidence to get involved and organize. And so when you want to be pushing your neighbors or people around you to join their tenant organizations or get more involved in the work that you're doing, I think, that kind of storytelling and building trust really comes from like that development of empathy between people and being able to articulate your own experience. And so just like making sure that the people around you know that all they really need to successfully organize is to really be claiming their own experiences. Because if you're organizing based on issues you're facing, That's all of the information that you really need. And then the supports that they are concerned about will come from the communities that they're now developing relationships with.
All right, we're gonna go to Divya. How do you organize with rules around social distancing?
Yeah, I think the thing I want to emphasize is that you're not organizing in a vacuum in this moment. There are so many organizations represented by a lot of people on this call today, and so many more that are part of our networks that are like eager, like so eager to like share our resources with you, right? Whether that's like as something small as like sharing our paid Zoom account with folks so you can have meetings longer than 40 minutes. Or, you know, we have access to mass texting apps that we're actively using to do outreach, right? We have like a lot of tools and resources that we'd love to share with you, and we'd love to like brainstorm with you and really just try to organize in community with each other. It's not just your building. Like we do have like this longer term vision of like a community of tenant unions, right? So in New York, we've got Community Voices Heard doing a lot of work in New York City and the Hudson Valley. And I think other folks should shout out where they're organizing and how to get in touch.
All right, let's do a round of shout outs. Tiana, where are you organizing and how can people reach KC Tenants?
And we are in Kansas City, Missouri. And we have website. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and all the other platforms. I wanted to speak to what we were saying about this climate and how hard it is to organize. Kind of two things. More people are being radicalized by this because they're impacted directly or indirectly very closely, so it makes them more open. A lot more people more open to these things. And two, people are craving a connection. When you're isolated and lonely and put in that situation, then you're craving a connection. So it's easier to be vulnerable and then allow them to be vulnerable as well.
Thanks for sharing that. And the rest of the panelists, actually in the interest of time, just drop your info for your organization in the chat so that folks can get in touch with you, the website or your email. We have another question of a kind of different nature from Jessica, who says, what about mom and pop landlords or people who own less than 5 properties and live in a single family home? I'm guessing that the implication is like, what do we do? Like, how do we organize against those types of people? Because maybe it feels harder to target someone who's running a small business versus a corporation. I want to start with John on this one.
Yeah, I think that for landlords right now, there are a lot of resources out there for small businesses. There are resources out there for mortgage holders and property owners. And you know, that if they own whatever amount of property they own, they're getting residual income from rent. They're also getting the value and appreciation of the investment that they put in. And I'm really confused by landlords right now because they're the only investors that I know that feel like they are entitled and guaranteed to a return on their investment, no matter what it does to your life. And if other businesses, not that any business is great, like had the expectation of, oh my God, well, I don't have any tenants, somebody's got to give me some money, right? Like, you know, those businesses would not be able to function. So I do understand that there are some mom and pop landlords. I know a lot of folks in our community that are landlords and that do better than others, but the reality is this is about our self-interest, and landlords have huge lobbies. They have all kinds of people advocating for their property ownership and protecting that, and tenants have very few people that are actually fighting for them and not nearly as much resources to fight back that fight. So even if you know that person, hopefully if you do know them, then they'll understand the position that you've been put in and understand that their investments will outlast anything that this moment presents to any individual.
Thanks, John. Okay, now I want to try an experiment. First time ever on Homes Guarantee Thursdays. We want to hear your voices. There are a lot of people on this call, so we've auto-muted everyone for good reason. I just experienced a Zoom bombing earlier today, and I'm not trying to deal with those trolls anymore. But right now, you should have an option at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, or I think you can do it by right-clicking your face also. So if you have a question that's related to organizing, especially if you've already started organizing in your building or with tenants in your community, please raise your hand and I'll unmute you to ask the question. Let's start with Elizabeth. Oh, Elizabeth, you lowered your hand. Anyone on the line with a question? Oh, okay. So Elizabeth, you should now be able to talk.
Hi, it wasn't a question. I just wanted to say hi and thank you for doing this.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Any questions on the line? And if you're joining by phone, you can dial *9 in order to ask your question. Okay, we're going to take a question from Carter.
Hey, all. Appreciate y'all for being here and having this. I just was curious if you all had any thoughts. I recently, I got laid off because my school I was working at closed down, and recently accepted a position that would require me to move in a few months in order to have work. And so I've been a little bit concerned about that issue coming up, working with my neighbors and organizing, and then, not being here in 3 months. So I was just wondering if you all had any thoughts about that.
Any of the panelists want to jump in?
I think organizing your neighbors shouldn't be dependent. Like, it is a really good question, but they shouldn't depend on you. You should organize in a way that is more horizontal and develop leaders in your building, so that, when you're not there, they can still keep it going. I think that's also something to, like, maybe not start with that, but to bring it up at some point, like, hey, like, this is really important to me. These are really tough times right now. And I do believe, like, in my heart that we need change in this building. But just so you know, like, I took a new job and I'm going to be moving in a few months. So I really want to build resilience, because I think that kind of vulnerability is also radical in and of itself. And I think, like Emma was saying earlier, like, it builds empathy when you share your story too. So you're not just moving for no reason either. I mean, you just told us that you lost your job. People will empathize with that.
Thanks, Tabatha. Anything to add for Connor? I think that was great. That summed it all up. Hopefully that was helpful to you, Carter, sorry, not Connor. I just saw a really interesting question in the Q&A, and I know we asked people to raise hands, but I feel like it's, like, really worth us addressing. Bo asked a question about structure-based organizing versus momentum-based organizing. And this is kind of related to our whole conversation about, like, trust and urgency, right? So there's a whole theory of organizing that's based on the momentum that is caused by certain moments or certain crises, and how we can channel that momentum of, like, a mass uprising in a moment like this one, and how to balance that with our thinking about building long-term structural power. I want to maybe throw that to John to begin with, but I want to open it up for a couple other panelists as well.
Yeah, so there's always going to be a tension between those two, and a reality of us being situational. So if you look at, like, corporations and the government, like, they all have a lot of different structures and different strategies for different things. So I will never say, like, we should never do momentum or we should always do structure based. But the reality is we have to look at the situation we're in. Momentum organizing works when you can build a base very quickly, but then it creates the problem of what do you do with that base beyond the immediate and simple ask that brought them together really fast. And so I was a part of Occupy Wall Street. That's part of how I got into organizing, and it dissipated, and many of those movements dissipate because it takes a lot of energy to continue momentum. And in physics, momentum is based on the weight that you have. So if you have a big object, it's going to take a lot of force to move it. But once it moves, it doesn't stop moving. And anything that moves quick, then moves fast, and then dissipates fast. So, like, we always have to think about that balance of what is the weight of knowledge and depth of relationship that we have, because we may move slower at first, but once we get rolling, we don't stop. Or if you want to have that lightning bolt, Sometimes we need that jolt, sometimes movement needs that. But my question for the momentum is like, what do you do from win to win? What do you do when that momentum starts to dissipate, and how do you hold the strength to keep momentum going over time?
Awesome. Juan, you look like you might have some thoughts on this. Do you want to jump in?
So that's actually interesting, because when I first started organizing my building, we were able to organize 10 buildings in a span of like a few months, because it was an urgent matter. Like, we didn't have an owner to our buildings. We found out that our building was owned by a bank in California. So we were able to organize these 10 buildings quickly. We had a huge success with this campaign. We even had Mayor Bloomberg at the time come and inspect the apartments. But like John said, after all that was won and we were able to negotiate like a contract with the new landlord, we got a lot of things done. Like throughout the years, we kind of like went apart, all the buildings. So at the moment, we're only organizing in 3 out of those 10 buildings, right? So it's really important that you develop some sort of like structure within each building to follow up with people. So in the 3 buildings that we have left, the reason why we're still around is because each building had a leader involved in the space, right? And within those buildings, we organized like floor captains in each building. So it really helps. So even within your own building, to develop some sort of structure that holds the tenant association together, right? And don't put everything on yourself alone at the same time. So it's really good. A lot of things happen through momentum, but you also have to try to continue to keep people together by following up and by developing a structure within that momentum that can last throughout, right? That can stay there even after you leave the building if you decide to move out. That to create that within that momentum, because you're gonna need that, because the fight is not gonna just last a month. It's gonna be, I've been at this for 10 years now, so that tells you right there.
Thanks, Juan. Okay, unfortunately, we're coming up on the hour, so I'm gonna hand it over to John to just wrap up some of the key lessons and themes of this call before we make some exciting announcements and talk about next steps. John.
Yes, so I just wanted to say that most of the dominant narratives, most of the ideas that capitalism puts out always want us to make rushed decisions and put us in fight, flight, or freeze mode, and trying to put us in that trauma space where we're not actually thinking, we're not feeling, and we're not in our guts. We're just ready to run and ready to fight, or if we don't know what to do, we freeze. And so what we're really trying to say is, we need other people to be able to hold us accountable to building together and to building an infrastructure that also has leadership development. I really appreciate Emma for leading us off, because the reality is we have to be organizing with younger and younger folks. We have to be taking out the knowledge of our elders and the experience of our elders and figuring out a way that we can build units of social cohesion where people are operating together, moving together in strength, not as tenants, as workers at every single level of society. So I think a lot of these lessons are not just about the housing moment, they're about the reality that we are in a crisis, and that in this crisis, it can get worse, and we are going to need each other in every aspect and at every level. When it comes to tenant organizing, it's really just getting back to basics and back to the humanity that our society and our culture is really designed to keep us away from. So I really appreciate everyone for sharing that, for hitting on those points. I encourage folks to reach out, put the email in the chat. We have the Homes at People's Action email to reach out for more explicit follow-up. And hopefully you'll join us on our next call. And I just wanted to toss it over to Juan to give us some next steps and a call to action.
All right, thank you, John. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today. You know, I feel drained, but you know, it's work like this and spaces like these that keep me grounded and keep me moving. You know, last week I lost my job, but I haven't even thought about that, honestly, because I'm so committed to the organizing and to getting my tenants in the position to win this fight for cancellation of rents and a potential rent strike. But I'm feeling super hyped from what I've heard tonight, and by the energy in the chat. You all sound like you're ready to start organizing, or you already started, and that's incredible and is really, really needed at this time. There are so many other emotions fueling us in this moment beyond that excitement, like Emma in New York and Linda in Chicago and Tiana in Kansas City and Tabatha in Los Angeles, and like comrades across the country. I'm angry. You know, I'm not happy. Housing, landlords are harassing our neighbors for rent payments that we simply don't have, and industries are being bailed out left and right, while we all know people who are making choices between medicines and rent. Like, I know people in my building that don't know what to do right now. They don't know whether they should go out shopping for food or save their money for rent, and that ain't right. So I need you to take action like us, so we can transform private pain into public power, and so we can win common sense policies like rent and mortgage suspensions today, and so we can win a home guarantee tomorrow. So here's what you can do right after this call. Number one, keep organizing and tell us how it's going. If you haven't already, make a list of everyone you know in your building around to your neighbors, and invite people to like a virtual tenant meeting within the next week. I've been using WhatsApp like crazy. I mean, I even created a voice note in my WhatsApp, and I just started circulating that around the neighborhood. If you've already started, send us an email at homes@peoplesaction.org to tell us how it's going and to share the victories and the challenges along the way. Number two, support the fight for national rent and mortgage suspension. Next week, we're going to have a very exciting update regarding our campaign to win rent and mortgage suspension. Stay tuned and follow along, #HomesGuarantee and #RentZero. Put your name in the chat if you're ready to take action with us next week, and then again on May 1st. All right? Also, please keep showing up. We're all home right now. We all can log on to Zoom real quick and hop on a call. We're going to do another call here, same time next week. Show up and bring others from your building. We will dig one level deeper and support you in planning for the next steps. All right, so I'm going to give it up now to Tiana.
Thank you so much, Juan, and thanks to all of our other panelists and to all of you guys who have attended tonight. You'll receive an email from us tomorrow morning to follow up from this call. You can find us on Twitter at #RentZero and #HomesGuarantee. And we'll see you back for another field call, same time next week. Stay safe and take care.